colleagues are about to speak on his legacy. Let's take you there live.
Inaugurated by former President Halima Motlanthe on the 10th of April last year, the 70's group has made the depth and breadth of its skills and experiential base available to our country to deepen and safeguard our democratic gains, building necessary bridges in a sea of tumultuous contestation, divisive rhetoric, and intolerance, and work together to restore our common humanity while building a nation that all of us can be proud of. Having been stirred into becoming unashamedly political, despite intense apartheid security police harassment, jailing, banning orders, and death, we dented the narrow ethnicity, the Bantustan system, and apartheid fearlessly. And we offer ourselves as a force to unite all our people, rediscovering our common humanity through anti-sectarian, anti-racist, and anti-sexist action. At a time when we should be celebrating and consolidating our hard-won freedoms, cherishing our diversity, we're confronting our most perilous and troubling period in the short history of our democracy. Rampant racism, sexism, violence, poverty, hunger, unemployment, and corruption, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, appear endemic. To explore how we descended here and Steve Biko's lessons for us in this unparalleled period of intense personal and public reflections, we have a distinguished panel of persons who were central not only to the development of Black consciousness, who were very close to Biko from his medical students' days. I am Sats Cooper, one of the members of the 70's group, and I have great pleasure in calling upon Mampela Rampele, a medical doctor, a political prisoner, someone who was banned, a member of SASO, the South African Students' Organization, the Black People's Convention, BPC, and Black Community Programs, an academic anthropologist, and the first Black and female Vice-Chancellor of UCT. Dr. Rampele will speak on Ubuntu values-based governance, critical to reimagining and reclaiming our human beingness. Over to Dr. Mampela.
Today we celebrate a life well lived, a life driven by a spirit that lives on. It is that spirit that inspired the Black consciousness movement. The enduring legacy of the Black consciousness movement is the raising of our consciousness of the importance of liberating ourselves from mental slavery imposed by colonial conquest and apartheid. We became actively conscious of the power to name ourselves. The slogan, "I'm Black and I'm proud," became a mobilizing tool for a people who had acquiesced to their own oppression by accepting being called non-whites and non-Europeans. This acquiescence signaled acceptance of whiteness as a standard by which to judge what is good, what is successful, and what is beautiful. Self-liberation and naming ourselves became the essential ingredients of the reinvigoration of the struggle for freedom in our country. We became critical thinking shapers of the future we were aspiring to. The erasure of the lessons and achievements of that period of the late 60s to the mid 80s from our liberation history has impoverished us as a people. We have robbed ourselves of a stronger foundation for reconstructing and rebuilding our country post-1994. The root cause of our problems is the failure to acknowledge the impact of racism and its socio-economic engineering of poverty on our society. The ANC was too eager to take command and control of state institutions and resources to pay attention to the need to heal the wounds of our ugly, divided past, to establish a culture of Ubuntu, that respect for human rights and promotion of dignity of all citizens. Establishing a political and socio-economic system infused with Ubuntu is the only guarantor of a prosperous nation united in its diversity. The neglect of the establishment of this values-based governance system was not a mistake. It was a deliberate strategy by those committed to command and control politics in the governing party to ensure that the majority and poor remain dependent on new political leadership. Attempts by Professor Kada Asmal, then Minister of Education, to introduce values-based civic education in our education system in the early 2000s were blocked by the ANC government. It should come as no surprise that racism is now rearing its ugly head, as evidenced by the hair issue. And I'm not just talking about the Clicks advert. I'm talking about corporate South Africa that insists that young African women wear weaves to look tidy. The inferiority and superiority complexes that we challenged in the late 60s and 80s are back with a vengeance. The DA non-racialism that takes no responsibility for the impact of white privilege is reminiscent of the liberal politics of the 1960s. Our failure to transform our inherited socio-economic system into one that is based on shared prosperity has widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots, making the realization of a society united in its diversity difficult. Today, more value is attached to having rather than to being human. This fuels the levels of greed in our society in both the public and the private sectors. Most people's self-worth and the worth of those who look like them has become distorted by the elevation of material accumulation above the dignity inherent in being human. Black people have suffered the most from the culture of insatiable greed, corruption, incompetence, and neglect of public services since 1994. The ANC as the governing party has failed dismally to promote meritocracy and the healing of its own members to ensure that they assume a public service ethos. The same lack of public service ethos applies to the DA governance in the Western Cape. A culture of entitlement at all levels of government to state resources has become the signal of how far down we have gone. The private sector has also played an active role in promoting policies of Black economic empowerment that have delayed the fundamental transformation of our economy that is needed for us to be the society so many sacrificed their lives for. Biko's words continue to resonate, and he's saying that the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressed is the mind of the oppressed. South African citizens, like those of post-colonial societies elsewhere, have allowed their minds to remain captive by those in power. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to free our minds and souls from those who have falsely styled themselves as our liberators. These self-styled liberators have simply stepped into the shoes of yesterday's oppressors. A self-liberated people needs to remember that the limits of the powers of the oppressor are determined by the extent of the permission granted them by the oppressed. It is time for us to stop the abuse of power by self-styled liberators and recapture the initiative to promote self-liberation of every citizen. Citizens must demand accountability from their leaders in both the public and the private sector. We, the people, need to campaign far and wide to put pressure on our President Ramaphosa, a product of the Black Consciousness Movement and the main author of our Constitution, to uproot corruption and to promote effective, accountable public service. Paulo Freire, a revolutionary educationalist who inspired our generation, once said, "Authentic humanism consists in permitting the emergence of the awareness of our full humanity as a condition and as an obligation, as a situation and as a project." In order to establish a reimagined and empowered society, we need to embrace the values of Ubuntu. We need to redesign our education systems, including civic education, to focus on processes of co-creation, of learning, and promotion of higher consciousness amongst children, teachers, parents, so that they can use their power to shape the future they desire. Gender-based violence ravaging our society cannot be ended by only dealing with it as a criminal justice matter. Gender-based violence is a symptom of the dehumanization of men and women whose relationships have become framed by power and domination. We need self-liberated men to embrace their masculinity as a gift to their partners, to their families, and to their communities. Women also need self-liberation to embrace their femininity as a gift to their partners, their families, and communities. Healing the relationships between men and women, men and men, women and women, is part of the unfinished healing work of raising the consciousness of the gift that is our human beingness. Kinako, ixesha lifikile. The time for a national consciousness movement has come. We, the people, need to lead the charge to demand the healing of our bleeding nation, to eradicate racism and sexism. We need to utilize Africa's heritage of circles of healing to enable every citizen to acknowledge their wounds of inferiority and superiority complexes. We need to work with others within such safe spaces to free our souls, minds, and bodies to become the human beings God created us to be. Self-liberation through higher social consciousness is essential to ensuring that we can unself-consciously call ourselves citizens of this beautiful nation, united in our diversity. The greatest honor we can offer Steve Biko is to complete the freedom struggle he sacrificed his life for, to enable every citizen to demand their rights and assume their responsibilities to give this world a more human face. I thank you.
We now have a reflection from Ambassador Tenjiwe Mtinso, who's the South African ambassador to Spain and who was a journalist, a trade unionist, an activist from the late 60s, a member of the ANC and MK, and who has held various positions in the liberation movement. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Seth. Today is the Happy New Year for Ethiopia. So I should start by saying Melkam Adis Amet, which I learned is Happy New Year. My presentation is going to be a difficult one after Mampela. But I will just reflect on my own journey in Black consciousness, that personal experience, which I think that may benefit, especially some of the younger people. My journey in the Black consciousness movement was not incidental, but was reflective of the times and circumstances confronted by millions of African women who were faced with triple oppression of race, class, and gender. Having been raised by a hospital cleaner, my mother, my chances of success were almost zero. But through the sacrifices of my mother and the greater Black solidarity, I found myself at 40. After many stints in the labor movement, as I worked in many jobs from the age of 16. I met Steve in 1973 when I joined the Black Consciousness Commune, which I call the Black Consciousness Tribe in Queen Williamstown, after my expulsion from Forte, where I joined SASO. Incidentally, I must confess, I'm not a founder of SASO. I found this train led by yourselves, Seth and Mampila and Bani, already in motion. I was immediately captivated by both Steve and the philosophy of Black consciousness, which has since influenced my approach in life, including my political life in the African National Congress, which I joined in 1978. For the record, I am still a Black consciousness ardent believer, as Black consciousness is a philosophy, a belief system that cannot be organization bound. The King Williamstown tribe was a real embodiment of Black consciousness. As a 24-year-old former worker, I had never seen a group of such principled young people. In all my previous long working experience of 7 years, these young people oozed so much self-confidence, self-reliance, self-respect, self-love, self-pride, defiance, commitment, and bravery. I had to learn very quickly that even as an uneducated young woman, I was a worthy being and capable of contributing to the freedom of my country. Steve, together with the rest, ignited in me such pride, a sense of identity and dignity and belonging and self-responsibility, and unleashed in me flames for self-liberation and the liberation of my country. I understood then, as I understand now, that decolonization of the mind is a prerequisite for decolonization of our country. It is an understanding we desperately need to re-inject into our society, our country, and our young people. I personally found Steve to be such a warm, humane, caring, ethical, loving, proud, brave, and naughty human being with a great sense of humor. He possessed that rare political clarity and thought processes that combined African values, principled native activism, with revolutionary intellectualism that shook the entirety of the vicious apartheid establishment to the core, even at that tender age. Under Steve's leadership, and we in the King Williamstown Black Consciousness Tribe not only served, but knew we had to serve with excellence. Mediocrity was not in our dictionary. Perhaps the discussions about Black excellence need to take a page from the experiences of the Black consciousness of that time. I was volunteered by Steve and the tribe to be a journalist of the Daily Dispatch because Donald Woods had said that he does not have a Black journalist. Mapetla Mohabi was volunteered as a weekly columnist. Both of us underwent a crash course in journalism led by Steve himself, and we knew we had to be the best. We may not have succeeded, but I know that we were a pain to the system. So began my life as a journalist and a member of the Union of Black Journalists, UBJ, which we formed as part of the many other Black consciousness-inspired organizations. Black consciousness journalists of that time were harassed, they were detained, they were tortured, they were banished, they were restricted, but their commitment was never extinguished. Perhaps the journalists of today can learn from those of that time. Just as an aside, I did not have a car at that particular time and I had to do my work. And the tribe collected money and bought me a Volkswagen Beetle, which was actually a communal car. Please don't mistake this for those friends who loan others 2 million so that they can buy 3 million cars because they are suffering. This was a tool to ensure that I did my work effectively. None of us earned enough to feed ourselves. We did not live a life of opulence or luxury, but we were able to satisfy our basic needs, sharing whatever we had. Material possessions did not define us. Many of us lived mainly in Steve's home in Ginsberg. True to the Ubuntu philosophy, Mam Tete, his mother, took us as her children, poor as she was. The spirit of solidarity support was indeed our way of life. It is a life which I wish could be understood and lived both by the old and the young of today. We spread the ideas of Black consciousness not only through workshops, but we engaged primarily through the community programs we initiated and worked in. This was in line with the philosophy of self-actualization. For talent itself by itself is useless unless it is utilized for the greater good of society and of humanity. We believed in the ability of the grassroots and communities to do things for themselves with a little help from us. We worked with communities, helping them build schools, houses, clinics, home industries, etc. Regrettably, democracy and expectations on government to, quote, deliver the better life, close quotes, they promised, has reduced the poor to a state of such dependence that all our community-based projects collapsed for lack of support from government and others. Even the Zinyoka Clinic of Mampila, which we built, has never been renovated and is still as it was in 1977. How I wish the spirit of Zimele, of Vukuzenzele, based on the self-reliance of Black consciousness and way of life, could again flourish with a little help from our democratic government.
All right, so we have to come out of that conversation that's taking place there. That was Tenjiwe Mtinzo, who's the South African ambassador to Spain, part of the 70's group, reflecting and the work that they did together with Steve Biko back in the 70's. And just before that, we heard from Mampela Rampili. And Sass Cooper is chairing this conversation. And all of this, of course, ahead of the Steve Biko annual memorial lecture, which will be taking place in the next hour or so.